Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be doing a wrap up of all the books that I read between July and September. So this is the pile that I've got this time, and this is actually quite good for me because in my last video I'd read 15 books between January and June, so that was 6 months, and then in only 2 months I've managed to read 10 because I've got 2 on my Kindle as well, so I think that's pretty good going. So yeah, if I just talk about these and then I'll be finally up to date and I'll be able to do monthly or every so often wrap-ups that are a bit more up to date. So the first book I read was Then She Was Gone by Jewell, and if you watched my book haul video you might recognise this and a few of the others that I'm going to talk about today, because I did mention it in there, so you might already know what it's about, but for those of you who don't know, this is a book about a girl called Ellie who went missing when she was 15, 10 years ago, and they've never found out what happened to her, and her mother Laurel has never given up hope of finding out what happened to her, where she is. So in the present day, Ellie's mother is sat in a cafe and she meets a handsome stranger called Floyd who she starts seeing, and she meets Floyd's 9-year-old daughter and she's taken aback because she looks just like Ellie, and all the questions that she's had over the years are just coming bubbling up to the surface. So that's how this book starts, and I ended up really liking this book. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. I picked it up thinking it would be like your typical thriller story, but I feel like it was a lot more than that. It was a lot more emotional and I was really invested in the characters. I thought they were just really well written and I genuinely cared about what was happening, which for some thrillers you don't really get a chance to get connected with any of the characters, but I feel like you really do in this story. Some of the best parts about this story were seeing the family relationships that are going on within Ellie's family who are missing her. I ended up not giving this book a 5 out of 5 because the thriller aspect of it, whilst it was still good, I thought that some of the reveals were slightly more predictable, but that didn't take away from my enjoyment of this story. I just felt like I was expecting more twists or expecting something else to happen which didn't come. There are some interesting mysteries, although you find some things out early on. You stick around to read about like the intentions behind certain decisions and behind certain characters and what they were feeling, which I thought was the most interesting part of this book. So if you're looking for a thriller that's a bit more character focused, as opposed to just being about all the twists and turns, then this is a good one for having a bit of both. Next I ended up reading Slaughterhouse 5 by Vonnegut, and I read this, well, it's been on my to be read list for the last 10 years or something like that. It's one of those modern classics that I've just had on my list to read for a long time, and my boyfriend really likes Vonnegut, so I thought it was about time that I finally got round to it. I ended up giving this book a 3 out of 5 because although I did like it, with it being hailed as like one of the top 100 books of all time, I didn't find it as profound or as impactful on me personally as I thought it should have been. So this book is like an anti-war book, and it was written in 1969 by Vonnegut, and it's semi-autobiographical because the main event in this book is the firebombing of Dresden in Germany, and Vonnegut was actually involved in that during his time in the war. So that aspect of it, there is some truth to it, but the main storyline is following a guy called Billy Pilgrim who becomes unstuck in time in his own timeline. So sometimes he will just pass out in his current state and then wake up 20 years in the future, living his life at age 40 or whatever, and he just kind of flicks between his own timeline in life. So I found that part really interesting, and it was quite a good way to show Billy Pilgrim's life in a fast-paced and interesting way. However, I did have some problems with the format of this book, I guess, or the style. A lot of the chapters are quite short. I don't know if you can see, but like this is not a chapter, a paragraph. This paragraph here, there was a lot of like gaps between paragraphs. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me it just felt a bit choppy and a bit like fragmented, and it didn't flow as well as I would prefer writing to flow. So that might just be like a personal style that I don't really get on with. However, I really did like Vonnegut's comedy. I thought it was really funny at parts, and I really liked how he wrote his characters. He uses a lot of metaphors and he paints his characters in a really vivid way that are really memorable. Even if he just describes them with one sentence, you can just picture them in quite a comedic way. And I quite liked the black comedy satire kind of style of this book. But yeah, although I liked it, and I will read more of Kurt Vonnegut's work, probably more his short stories, because I think I would prefer his style in that sort of format. I won't remember this as like a really profound and hard-hitting book that I would personally put in the top 100 books of all time kind of realm. There's just other modern classics I prefer more, probably more on the dystopia side, so like 1984, Brave New World, that sort of thing. So yeah, I did like this, but it just wasn't my favourite. Next up, I read The Silent Patient by Michaelides, and this was a really good thriller. I ended up giving this quite a high rating of like 4.5 out of 5. This book is set in a mental health unit, in a secure unit, which houses Alicia Berenson, and she has just shot her husband 5 times in the head, and she hasn't spoken a word since. And nobody knows why she did it, and nobody can figure it out, because everybody thought that they had a perfect relationship and she had the perfect life. So she's just baffling everyone. She's become infamous and she's always in the news for it. And our main character, Theo, is a psychotherapist who thinks that he can possibly treat her and get her to speak. So he transfers into the mental health ward where Alicia is being held, and yeah, is it hoping to treat her and get her to finally talk and finally figure out why she killed her husband. So this was a really good thriller. It paired Theo's perspective alongside Alicia's diary entries, and I read it really quickly. It was just really interesting. It was full of twists and turns and exciting moments that made it a really fast read. One thing I would say if you're going to read this is to not read the reviews in like the sleeve of this book. I don't personally do that very often, but because I was really excited about this book, I did have a look at some of the like reviews at the start, and I feel like it did ruin my reading experience a little bit, because I started this expecting something, whereas I feel like if you go into it a bit more blind, then you have a better time with it. So when I finished this book, I told my sister to read it because I thought she would really like this book, and I told her not to read the reviews. And when we were talking about this after she finished it, I do think she had a better time with it, and I probably would have given it a 5 out of 5 if I hadn't have gone into it knowing certain things that other people were thinking about it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I would go into this not expecting anything from it, just knowing the initial premise and then just going into it, and then I think that's when you'll have the best time with it. Hopefully that made some sort of sense. But I thought that this ending was really perfect. I didn't expect where it was going to go, and I just thought it was really well done, and I will definitely read more thrillers by Michaelides if he brings any more out. So the next book I read was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and this is more of a literary fiction book, and it's following this girl called Kia Clark, who is known as the Marsh Girl in her local community. She's basically been abandoned by her family at a very young age, and she lives in the marshlands that are surrounding the town of Barclay Cove. She fends for herself, she finds her own food, she's learnt to survive on her own from the age of like 8 years old or something like that. So yes, we're following Kia through her childhood and up to the age where she's starting to realise how lonely she is, and she starts craving a bit of human interaction and some sort of connection with somebody else. And there are 2 boys in the local town of Barclay Cove who become interested in Kia. So this was a really interesting story, and I really liked seeing how Kia grew grew into a young woman and like she doesn't really need anybody else, but she still craves this human interaction. I also really liked the parts of this book that were about nature, and there is a lot of them because she's living in the marshes and it's very descriptive about the marsh and all the creatures that live there. Those parts are very descriptive and I really liked reading about that. Delia Owens was actually an award-winning non-fiction writer who wrote about like nature, and I think she's like a zoologist or something as well. So I think those parts of this book really stand out, and you can tell that she's clearly very knowledgeable, and I really liked that she gave Kia this knowledge as well. I initially picked this book up because I thought it was going to be quite similar to My Absolute Darling by Gabriel Talent, and this is one of my favourite books of all time, but it's sort of similar in the sense that it also follows a girl who is very young, doesn't have the best upbringing, and she learns to fend for herself, and she's very interested in nature, and yeah, it's kind of like her own adventures in the wild, and this book is sort of similar, but I did think that I preferred this one just a bit more. So the girl in this book is called Turtle, and I feel like I just had a bit more of a connection with the character in this book as opposed to this one. They're still both very good, but ultimately I do prefer this one. It's a lot darker than Where the Crawdads Sing, but if that's something that you're up for, then this is also a good book to read if you like the sound of this one. There was just something about this book that I wasn't fully sold with. I still gave it a 4 out of 5, but I was anticipating this to be like a 5 out of 5, but I think there was just some things that I wasn't completely sold on. For example, there's like courtroom scenes in this book, and I just felt like they didn't really fit with the rest of the story. And whilst I think that was probably intended because Kia has been so far removed from normal society, and for her to be involved in a court setting is probably intended to stand out and not kind of fit with the rest of the story, but for me I just didn't like that as much. I still really enjoyed this book and I thought it had a really good ending, but I just felt like I was more connected to Turtle in My Absolute Darling than I was to Kia in this book, and because I hold the other one in such high regards, I just feel like this one didn't come quite as close. Next up is The Killing Game by J.A. Kerley, and this one was a drag. This one was my own fault because I just added The Killing Lessons by Soul Black to my TBR, and I walked into my local charity shop, saw this and was like, oh my god, that's the one that I'm wanting to read. It was not. This is actually part of a series. It's part of the Carson Rider series, and it's like number 9 in the series, but for some reason I just thought this was the one I intended to read, but I didn't. However, with it being the 9th one in the series, that wasn't the issue, because it's one of those crime series that's written where you can pick it up at any point and you'll still follow with what's happening. It's sort of similar to the Grant County series by Karin, if you've read that, where obviously it's quite a long running series, but if you pick up book number 4 then you'll be fine. You'll just miss some of the details with the characters and you won't know like the backstory, but it won't affect the story of this book. So this book follows Detective Carson Rider as he's investigating a string of murders, and right from the get-go we know who's done it because we are also following the killer. His name is Gregory, and after a really humiliating incident with the police, he decides to ridicule them by committing a series of crimes that are seemingly unlinked and unrelated, and he's basically trying to embarrass them by killing a lot of people and having them not being able to solve the crime. So Gregory's parts in this were quite interesting because you got a lot of insight into his personality and why he was doing what he was doing, and there was also hints to his like tragic backstory, which were really interesting, but I don't think it delved into that as much as I would have liked. There were the occasional flashbacks to his childhood, but I feel like it didn't really go anywhere. So Gregory's side of this was okay, but the detective Carson Rider, I could not stand him. He was such an arrogant character. I didn't even want him to solve it because I was like, I don't even like you as a character. He was just really arrogant, and he would randomly start talking about like, I would call it like arrogant cop talk, where he's like showing off about things that he's done, whether that's in like previous books in this series or just like using weird abbreviations and slang that didn't fit with the rest of his voice in this story. I don't know, it just seemed like it almost felt like locker room chat, or like he was bantering with like other police officers in his squad, but he was just like talking to the reader, and it really just pissed me off. I don't know, he was just like a bit unlikable. And I also thought that the love interest in this story, Wendy, was just the worst written character ever. She was just so overly sexualized, and she had like no personality except for being like really smart and really pretty, and I'm like, oh, it's okay, it's just boring. Like, there's one scene in this book where there's an attempted suicide happening, and this Wendy character just decides to like strip off her clothes in a provocative way to try and distract the guy from committing suicide. Now, if that's not the most cringy male gaze influence scene that I've ever read, then I don't know what is, because it just pissed me off. I was like, is this meant to make her look sexy and like desirable? And oh, it was just embarrassing. I was genuinely embarrassed for her character, because I was like, what are you doing? Oh, it was just awful. Like, who is enjoying this other than maybe like some creepy guy that would be like, oh my god, like, yeah, that's so hot. Ugh. And the ending of this book was so trash. It was so rushed and unsatisfactory and like unfinished, and it like, I know that this is part of a series, but it didn't even allude to the fact that this story would carry on into the next book. It was kind of like that was it, and in the next book the police officer was like going to go on to a different force and like do something else. So this story ended, and it was just the worst way. It was just the worst way. It was such a, I did not like this. I gave it like a 1 out of 5, and although it is my own fault for picking it up, no thanks. The next book I read was The Good Daughter by Karin Slaughter, and Karin Slaughter is one of my favourite authors ever, and it was finally about time that I got around to this book. One of her other standalone books, Pretty Girls, is one of my favourite books of all time, and her Grant County series is one of my favourite series of all time. So I just love anything that she writes, and this was no exception. I gave this like a 4.5 out of 5. The only reason I didn't give it a 5 is because Pretty Girls is still my favourite, and that one is a 5 out of 5 in my opinion. So this book starts 28 years in the past, and it's about two sisters, Charlotte and Samantha, and they live with their mother and father in like a little farmhouse, and there's a home invasion attack on the farmhouse, and it leaves their mother dead, and it's a bit of a cliffhanger as to what happens to Charlotte and Samantha. And now 28 years later, so in the present day, Charlotte is still living in the same town, in her hometown, and she's now a lawyer, and she ends up being the first witness on the scene of a really tragic event that happens in her town, and she gets embroiled in this, and she's also trying to come to terms with what happened to her and her family 28 years ago. I just think Karin Slaughter does such a good job of writing thriller books and like crime thrillers where you are so invested in the characters as well, and I think that just like steps them up from other regular thriller books, and I think she's just so good at that. This book is very violent and very awful, so you need to be prepared for that if you're going to go into this. The first 30 to 50 pages of this book are so violent and grotesque and awful. I actually cried at the end of finishing reading them, because I was just thinking, oh, if this was happening to me and my sister and my mum, it was just awful. I don't think she uses violence for the sake of using violence. She writes it still in a really emotional way, and she just handles it really well. And then there's also a scene in this book about 2/3 of the way in. It was actually genuinely gut-wrenching, and I had to put it down and just take a minute to be like, what have I just read? Like, oh my god. So you do need to be prepared for this book. It does have a lot of physical violence and sexual violence in it, so if that's something that you don't want to read or you need to be prepared for, then just keep that in mind. But this book was just so good. It was so emotional, and I will remember some of the scenes in this book forever, both because they've haunted me, but also because you just really care about the characters and what happens to them. It just didn't quite match up to Pretty Girls for me. Some of the reveals in this book I wasn't overly keen on. I didn't dislike them, but I didn't love them. but that didn't really diminish from my enjoyment of this story, and I think that says a lot about how much I love Karin Slaughter. That some of the twists and turns aren't my favourite, but I still just end up loving the story because I love the characters and I just love how she writes. So yeah, I recommend this book and anything else that Karin Slaughter has written. She is one of my top authors of all time and I will praise her forever. The next book I read was The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton, and this was a really interesting book. I ended up giving this like a 4 out of 5. This book is described as a mix between Agatha Christie and Groundhog Day, and it's set at Blackheath Manor, which is this really creepy, almost abandoned mansion in the middle of nowhere, and the Hardcastle family are hosting a party to celebrate Evelyn coming back over from Paris. And one of the guests, Aidan Bishop, is reliving this day over and over again, but each day he's waking up in a different body or a different host, and he doesn't really know why he's there, but he's being told that he's going to relive the same day over and over again until he can solve the murder of Evelyn Hardcastle, because she is killed at the end of this day. No matter what happens, she always dies. So I really enjoyed this book. It was really atmospheric, and I think it was really interesting to read this in autumn because it's set during a storm, and it was nice to just cozy up and get really involved with this story. However, I do think that it is a very complicated and complex story, and that will definitely put some readers off, I think. At times I would have liked to have seen like a mind map or a timeline, or I felt like I should have been taking notes, because there was so many little details in this book that would easily get forgotten because you are following like 7 different versions of the same day, and all these little intricate webs are like coming together. And although that is really satisfying to see the story come together, you can feel a little bit lost and a bit overwhelmed at times. Or at least I did anyway. But this style did come with its benefits. I mean, it felt really clever and I just loved seeing it all come together. The only way I can describe it is if you've seen Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, where Harry and Hermione go back in time and it's revealed that Hermione was the one to like throw the rock at Harry when they're in Hagrid's hut, and that when Hermione turns around and looks in the forest she sees herself, and like just all those little things coming together that are quite satisfying. But yeah, sometimes I don't know, it also felt very long. It's like 500 pages and I couldn't help but think maybe this could have been cut down a little bit. I'm not sure where from, but obviously because it's like the same 7 days over and over again, it's not repetitive because he's living them in a different body, but I don't know, I just feel like there could have been some sort of way to just condense it a little bit because it was a little bit too long in my opinion. However, I did think that this book ended really well. I really liked how it all came together. Some of the explanations as to what was going on, I just really liked them and I didn't expect them. However, I do remember finishing this book, and although I liked one of the reveals a lot, I did have this like niggling question in the back of my head that was like, well, if that's the case, then what about, like, there was just something that I'm not sure if it's a plot hole or not, or I don't know if it's just like ignorance from the author, but I don't want to say it because it's a big spoiler. So if you're intrigued, then I guess like message me or something on like on Instagram. But yeah, I did have like a slight issue with one of the reveals, but when I was looking at reviews for this, I didn't really see anyone else mentioning this, so I don't know if I just missed something that kind of impacted my overall rating of it, because although everything seemed to line up seamlessly, there was just this one thing that I just like couldn't get my head around. So yeah, that was my thoughts on that. So I would recommend this book if you like long-winded mysteries where there's a lot going on and you can keep up with quite a lot of different threads coming together. And I really did like that, and it felt very autumnal, so it was good to read at this time of year. However, I do think it was quite overly complicated and it could have been shortened down, possibly. But I did give this one, I think, a 4 out of 5. When I finished it, I gave it a 5 out of 5 because I was just really blown away by the ending. But yeah, after I had this like question about something that happened, I was like, well, I can't give, it's not my usual 5 out of 5 tier book. So I gave this a 4, but I did really like it. So I would recommend it if it sounds like it's something up your street. And the last physical book that I read is The Last Time I Lied by Riley Sagar, and I gave this one a 3 out of 5. I liked it, but I had quite a lot of issues with it. So this book is about a girl called Emma who went to Camp Nightingale 15 years ago, and she was bunking with 3 other girls in this cabin. And one night Emma wakes up to see the 3 girls all sneaking out of the cabin, and they're never seen again. And nobody ever knows what happened to them. They just disappeared off the face of the earth, and Camp Nightingale was shut down for the next 15 years. So in the present day, Emma is now a painter, and she's at an art exhibition for her own work, and the owner of Camp Nightingale approaches her and asks her to come back to Camp Nightingale for the reopening of the camp and act as a camp counsellor and teach art. So Emma accepts because she wants to go back and try and see if she can figure out what happened to the girls, but there are also hints that she is withholding her own secrets about her time at Camp Nightingale, and that she has lied a few times about the disappearance of these 3 girls. Things that I liked about this book: I liked the setting, I liked the creepy camp vibe in the middle of nowhere with like this deserted lake and like just surrounded by forest. And I quite liked how creepy it felt. I did have quite a few issues with the writing in this book. I remember commenting to my boyfriend, how many times can this character have a shiver run down her spine, or her heart stop, or her blood freezes in her veins, and that kind of language. It just felt a bit repetitive after a while, and it lost its impact. There were also quite a few action scenes in this book that I thought could have been written a bit better. There's one scene in this book where a character is under the threat of drowning, and it just reminded me of N.K. Jemisin in the Broken Earth trilogy, where somebody's drowning and the writing is just so exhilarating that you feel like you are that character drowning. Whereas this one, I just thought it was a bit like mediocre, and it just wasn't written as well as I've read those kind of scenes written in other books. I also am a bit tired of the bitchy popular girl trope. There's this character who went missing 15 years ago at the camp who gave me like Alison De Laurentiis vibes from Pretty Little Liars. She was just very popular girl, bitchy girl, mean, and I'm just a bit tired of that trope. I mean, if you like that, then you might like this book, but it's just not my favourite trope anymore because I just don't really like characters that are like that, so I didn't feel very invested in her as a character. Also, there was a reveal that I thought was written really poorly. I just hate in books when a character confesses to everything that they've done and how they've managed to avoid suspicion up to that point for no real reason. Like, it's not like they've been caught out or anything. I don't know, it's just they've like randomly come forward and confessed to everything, and I just feel like it's a very easy and lazy way to reveal information or a twist. I don't know, I just don't really like that. However, I really liked the ending of this book. I thought that was really good, and it definitely redeemed itself a little bit, but I felt like everything that came before it just wasn't as good. Basically, I just thought that some of the reveals were a bit predictable or just a bit average, mediocre, up until the ending, which I did like. So yeah, I don't know if I'll read any more books by Riley Sagar, because this is the only one where I've read the back and I've been interested in it, so I don't think I will. It was an okay read, I just had issues with it, and the ending bumped it up to a 3 out of 5, whereas I think it probably would have been a 2 otherwise. And then the last 2 books that I actually read on my Kindle, so I'll put the covers somewhere around my face here. The first book that I read was The Nightingale by Kristin Hannah, and this one was such a good book. I ended up giving this one a 5 out of 5. It's a historical wartime fiction set in France during World War II, and it's following 2 sisters, Vianne and Isabel, as they are struggling to survive and win back their freedom in war-torn, Nazi-occupied France. This was such an emotional book because it really focuses on women during wartime, and it's not all just about the soldiers on the battlefield. There was a lot of tragic things that were happening to the people that were left at home as well. I really like the dynamics between the two sisters. They're very different characters, and their idea of resisting the Nazis was very different. Isabel was younger, she was more passionate, and she was desperate to join the resistance movement, whereas Vianne is a family woman. Her husband has gone to fight and she's looking after their young daughter, and a Nazi officer has been requisitioned to her house, so now he lives with them. So for Isabel, she really wants to be loud and brash and, you know, resist in any way that she can, whereas Vianne is of the impression that she wants to be more careful, she wants to be a bit quieter and just get on with it and keep her head down in order to keep her and her family safe. I really liked how Kristin Hannah wrote the character of Beck, who is the Nazi officer that's staying with Vianne. I just thought he was really interesting and really compelling. His character just added a more human aspect to the enemy, I guess, and it wasn't just your bog standard, like, awful, horrible Nazi enemy character. But this book's also really sad. I mean, it's obviously bound to be quite sad if it's set during the war, but especially as the story goes on and the atrocities are getting more and more severe. I just really like how Kristin Hannah built it up to come to this really heartbreaking and emotional ending, and I did cry at this book even though I was finishing it on my lunch break at work, so there were people around me, but I definitely had tears in my eyes. But it was just such an impactful and powerful read, and I thought it was great. She's a really great author. Her writing was really beautiful. She described the village that Vianne lived in at the start in the most picturesque and serene way, and I was like, I just want to move to France right now. And as it's getting more war-torn, everything is just so beautiful. Even if it is describing horrible things, she's just got a really beautiful way with words, and I will definitely read her other books. So yeah, I would highly recommend that if you're into historical fiction. And lastly, I've got The Wives by Tarryn Fisher, and this one was... I really like this book, but I think it is going to be a love-hate type of book. I have read a book by Tarryn Fisher before called Marrow, and I really like that. So I've already got a bit used to her style and how she writes her stories. But this book is marketed as your typical thriller. It's about a woman called Thursday who is married to a guy called Seth, but he also has 2 other wives, so he has to split his time between his 3 wives, and Thursday only ends up seeing him 1 day a week, which is Thursday. And this arrangement is completely fine for everyone involved, except for when Thursday finds a receipt in Seth's jacket or something like that, and it has the full name of one of his other wives on it, and she starts getting a bit more curious and she starts looking her up on Facebook, and it gets to a point where she just gets a bit too obsessed with these other wives. She wants to find out everything there is to know about them, and yeah, I'll leave it there. This one was really interesting. I loved seeing how Thursday just got progressively more obsessed and her behaviour starts getting more and more questionable, and I just thought it was quite fun to read, if fun's the right word. There will be mixed opinions about some of the reveals in this book, whereas I personally really liked it. I've seen some people just think it wasn't for them, and I think that's just down to your personal preferences as a reader. I also really liked the ending of this book, and it really shocked me and just blew me away, and I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 when I finished it, and then I was like, no, it's a 4. I'm doing that now, aren't I? Like, if an ending is really good, then it will just leave me with such a good impression that I end up rating it so highly, and then after a few days I think, okay, it's not quite up to my usual standard for 5 out of 5, so I gave this one a 4 in the end. But I think it was really good, and it was really fun, and it was a wild roller coaster of a read. I never knew what was coming, I didn't know what to believe, and I also liked the unreliable narrator. I liked how you weren't quite sure whether you were on her side or not. You didn't know whether to believe her or not, and yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting read, and I think it's worth giving it a go. I have seen some people hate this book, but either way you're going to feel heated about it because you're either going to really like it or you're going to hate it, so maybe it's just worth the risk. So yeah, that's actually all the books that I've got to talk about today. Please let me know if you've read any of them before and what you thought, or if there's any that you think you might want to read now that you've heard me talking about it. I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe or like this video if you want to do either of those things, and it would be really nice if you could leave a comment, or if you want to chat with me over on my Instagram or my Goodreads, which I will link all in the description box. So yeah, that's it for today's video. I think my next video, I was going to do a reading vlog for A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, but I read another book this month which emotionally tore me apart, and I don't think I'm quite ready to start that one yet. But I will talk about that in my next wrap-up video. So I think I might do a reading vlog reading 3 thriller books, because as you can tell that is my favourite genre to read. So I think I might do that and then build my way up to A Little Life, because yeah, I'm still emotionally scarred from my last read. So yeah, I will see you in my next video, and goodbye.